The United States stands with Israel.
Israel has every right to defend itself.
Our government is signed up to support Israel unconditionally. We have no leadership and we have no strategy.
The world is witnessing a series of conflicts that are shaking the foundations of the global order. The Israel-Gaza War, the Russia-Ukraine War, and the U.S.-China rivalry are all signs of a changing geopolitical landscape. But how much do we really know about the causes and consequences of these wars? How much are we being misled by the mainstream media and the political elites? And how much are we missing the big picture of what is really going on behind the scenes? One person who has a clear vision of the truth is Colonel Douglas McGregor, a retired U.S. Army officer and a military analyst. He has just revealed some shocking facts about what has happened in the recent wars and how the U.S. has been playing a double game with its allies and enemies. He has exposed the hypocrisy and the lies of the U.S. foreign policy and how it has been serving the interest of a few powerful groups at the expense of the majority of the people. So what exactly has he said? Join us as we discuss how Colonel Douglas McGregor just revealed exactly what has been happening. Colonel Douglas began by exposing the lack of a national strategy in the U.S. He explained that a national strategy should encompass military power, economic development, and good relations with other countries for trade and business purposes. He added that a grand strategy should also include the advancement of technology and its integration into society and the military. However, the U.S. does not have such a strategy. Instead, it has a set of vague interests and it acts on them impulsively. These interests are not always aligned with a national interest. He said, for example, I would argue that we have no national strategic interest per se in eastern Ukraine. The only interest the U.S. ever had in Ukraine was to promote peace and stability in the region, which is something it failed to do. On the contrary, it has contributed to the escalation of the conflict. In the Middle East, the U.S. also does not have any interest in provoking a regional war against Israel, but again, it has ignored that in favor of what Colonel Douglas calls current interest, financially rewarding interest, or both. That means the U.S. will hastily portray Ukraine as a flawless democracy and that we all have a duty to protect it from the evil Russians who are some kind of remnants of the Soviet Union or whatever. According to the colonel, this is all nonsense and it makes no sense. He also lamented, there's no leadership. You know, there's no one in the White House per se, as far as I can tell, and the people who are there are simply drifting along with this ship of state wherever it takes them. So we're in a lot of trouble as a nation. We don't really identify our core interests and we don't effectively connect means and ends. We have no sense of constraints. Well, our resources are infinite and they're not. He was then questioned on how much credibility he believes the United States is losing on the world stage. For instance, Anthony Blinken in his recent trip to the Middle East was not treated like a U.S. official used to be treated, let's say 20 years ago. He was basically kicked out and made to wait and mostly disregarded. And to that, he said that the U.S. has been facing this challenge for a long time. He highlighted that before World War I, with the exception of the Spanish-American War, the U.S. primarily focused on building prosperity domestically and pursuing peace internationally. The formula for success was to develop a strong economic foundation, improve the standard of living, and foster an educated and hardworking population. The idea was that by doing so, the rest of the world would take notice, admire, and seek to emulate them. There was no intention or desire to intervene in the affairs of others, as it was not part of the country's founding principles or values. He then highlighted the significant impact of the lack of a clear national strategy on the credibility of the United States in global affairs. Anthony Blinken's recent trip to the Middle East serves as evidence that U.S. officials no longer command the same level of respect as they once did. This decline in credibility can be attributed in part to the country's failure to define its core interest and effectively connect its actions with its goals. Instead, the U.S. has been driven by immediate or financially lucrative interest, disregarding long-term consequences and limitations. However, this issue is not a recent development for the United States. Throughout history, the nation's success has been rooted in a focus on fostering domestic prosperity and pursuing peaceful relations abroad. Only in more recent times has there been a shift toward a more interventionist foreign policy approach. As a result, the country's credibility on the global stage has suffered, and significant efforts will be required to regain regain it. In fact, when Thomas Jefferson suggested that the U.S. should join with the Revolutionary French at the time, as you know, under Napoleon, and help them spread their revolution across the world, especially in Europe, Washington and Hamilton, who both like Jefferson, concluded that Jefferson had lost his mind. Washington made the point that no nation can be expected to move beyond the limits of its own interests. The U.S. had no interest in spreading revolution anywhere. It had only one overriding strategic interest: to secure the North American continent so that English-speaking people could conquer and rule the nation from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Within that framework, the U.S. would have a somewhat democratic republic, although not as much as people think. It was designed to promote stability and peace. Going back to Vietnam, by essentially signing on for these wars of intervention, the U.S. certainly went there under false pretenses and deluded itself into believing that it was somehow spreading democracy and a new liberal order, or whatever you want to call it. By killing 2 million Vietnamese, that didn't work out very well, and it lost a lot of credibility as a result of that. The U.S. then worked to bring it back, and it finally did regain a lot of credibility, particularly in 1991, not just for military reasons, but the way that it handled the issue diplomatically and its insistence that this was not a war of conquest, that it was not interested in annexing or holding on to Iraq or anything else. It was simply trying to remove it as a danger to the world's oil concentration and keeping the oil flowing. That was it, really. So as a result, the U.S. was in pretty good shape. Then, the U.S. started this business of intervention after the fall or collapse of the Soviet state system. It began thinking it was the most important nation, believing its rights and values were universal, even though they weren't and never will be. As a result, it lost respect for other countries, their national interests, cultures, and ways of life. It's been a disaster. He was asked if Israel is facing a situation similar to Ukraine, where the U.S. is willing to fight Iran to the last Israeli. In response, he expressed his beliefs that the current situation in Israel is different from what's happening in Ukraine. Israel was established after World War II, thanks in large part to Harry Truman's support. The rationale behind this support was twofold. First, the Jews had suffered the Holocaust, and second, Truman's political advisors had convinced them that recognizing Israel would secure unlimited funds for the Democratic Party forever. He said that this prediction was largely accurate, as huge amounts of Jewish money have flowed into various political entities in the U.S. to maintain and strengthen the relationship and influence of Israel and the U.S. He said that this strategy has worked very well for Israel. However, the U.S. is not the same as it was decades ago. In Israel's previous wars, presidents had intervened and restrained Israel, as Eisenhower did in 1956 when he refused to support Israel's conquest of the Sinai Peninsula, or as Johnson did in 1967 when he set limits on how much support he would provide. He also mentioned Nixon in 1973, who told Israel that it had to withdraw from the Suez Canal or he would not be able to negotiate an end to the war. He compared these examples with the current situation where the Israeli government has declared that it wants to settle the score with the Muslim Arabs in Gaza once and for all. He said that Israel's goal is not only to destroy Hamas, but also to eliminate the source of Hamas, which is the 2.2 million Arabs living in Gaza. He said that no one has stood up and said that this is unacceptable and that the U.S. will not support or endorse such a plan. In his own words, this is a tough nut to crack, because what's different today is that I think Mr. Netanyahu has more influence and authority on the Hill than President Biden. He claimed that President Biden's administration is completely clueless. He said they seem to have no idea what to do. He pointed out that every time Blinken announced a policy position, Netanyahu rejected it and told him that it was not what Israel would do. He cited the recent example of Netanyahu saying that Israel will keep control of Gaza and police it even if Hamas is eliminated. He said that this contradicted Blinken's earlier statement that they were looking for a different solution that would not involve Israeli control of Gaza. He concluded that it is obvious that Israel's lobby in Washington has paid off and that it has given Netanyahu a lot of power and influence. This is a very dangerous situation for a superpower like the U.S. According to Colonel Douglas, the U.S. has no clue about the diversity of its population. He said that the government has no idea how many undocumented immigrants are really in the country. He revealed that he had talked to some anonymous sources from Homeland Security and he had asked them about the numbers that had been reported. He said that the official number is that the U.S. might have 8 million undocumented immigrants, but his sources laughed at that. They said, "You must be joking." They said, "We have at least 28 million, maybe more." They explained that 7 or 8 million had crossed the border since Biden became president. Most of the people that are shown on TV, the ones that have been caught, are only the ones that have been registered and given money and a a free ticket to anywhere in the U.S. But he said that the government does not really know who they are, what they think, and that no one in Washington seems to care. He said that the idea of assimilation, which was supposed to be Americanization, has been abandoned. He said that no one has to assimilate, no one is going to be thoroughly questioned about their background and their connections and their beliefs. He said that this is what has happened to the U.S. In his own words, we are on a self-destructive path, but it is a different kind of self-destruction. It is assisted self-destruction, with the government helping people to destroy us by flooding us with foreigners. And I would argue that this will become a real issue once we face a serious recession or worse, a depression, which more and more people think is possible. In the meantime, the U.S. is sending forces potentially to assist and support Israel. However, these forces are not meant for waging war against others. Their purpose is to support the security and survival of the Israeli state. Unfortunately, Mr. Netanyahu and his supporters see an opportunity to use American military power, which currently isn't engaged in border security or the defense of the United States, to settle scores with those they oppose in the Middle East. This is a dangerous situation because it could lead to the formation of a military alliance against Israel and the U.S. involving Turkey, Iran, and various Arab states. What do you think about this? Let us know in the comments section.